Thank you to everyone joining us today from across the country and around the world. I'm Abby Schwalb, Vice President of Programming here at Conscious Capitalism, Inc. On behalf of the entire CCI team, we appreciate you taking the time to learn and grow in community with us. Today, we're excited to welcome Kimberly Manns, CEO of H3 Diversity, to discuss the 6 traits inclusive leaders can cultivate to build community, culture, and competitive advantage. As many of you know, conscious capitalism is a philosophy that emphasizes the human nature of business, as well as a movement of business leaders from around the world working to change the practice and purpose of capitalism as a means to elevate humanity. Conscious Capitalism, Inc. is a nonprofit organization dedicated to catalyzing that movement by creating learning opportunities like today's session and building systems of support for practicing conscious capitalists through our senior leader network membership and engagement with our local chapters. Several times a month, we offer virtual gatherings as a way for the community to see how this philosophy takes shape in the leadership journeys and the business practices of those in our network. Today's gathering will run for about 45 minutes. I'll be in conversation with Kim for about 25 minutes, and then we'll transition to audience questions during the last 10 to 15 minutes of the session. So please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can during our time together. If you have any technical questions or issues, please email us at info@consciouscapitalism.org. Now I'm thrilled to introduce Kim Manns, a passionate leader with a talent for supporting organizations and addressing challenges of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Kim is a certified professional diversity coach and is also certified in the Fundamentals Interpersonal Relations Orientation Behavior Assessment. That is a mouthful, Kim. Her career in diversity, equity, inclusion began over 15 years ago in brand management at Procter & Gamble, where she led multicultural marketing for major company brands. Following her time at Procter & Gamble, she served the mayor of Baltimore as Deputy Director of Policy and Communications, where she focused on educational and economic disparities. Kim has dedicated her career to bringing diverse stakeholders together to create meaningful change. Kim, we are really excited to have you here with us today. I always love any opportunity to talk with you, and it just makes it more fun that we're in front of an audience. So welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. And so excited to be here with you and those that are in the audience, and looking forward to the questions and having some great conversation.
Excellent. Okay, so today we're here to talk about the 6 traits of inclusive leadership, which I initially learned about from you. And it really resonated with this framework as a way of helping me break down the work of becoming a more inclusive leader into areas that I'm able to wrap my head around, kind of chunks of knowledge. Plus, I do really love alliteration. So it's an extra added bonus that there's all these C's, gets me very happy. So can we start out by you saying a little bit more about where this framework comes from and why it appeals to you?
Absolutely. So this framework is one that I use in my training, both with leaders and the executive coaching that I do, because to me, it really put into words what I had seen in my experience as a leader, as well as what the context that leaders needed in order to achieve this goal of being an inclusive leader. So it's based on a report from Deloitte, a 2016 report that was really looking at global trends, where we were seeing this huge shifts in how we need to approach business based on a diversifying of several factors. One, diversity in markets, so having different social, cultural, and political dynamics in different marketplaces. Diversity in the customers that you're serving, so in those customers demanding that you know who they are and that you hear their voice and let them have input into the services and the products that you're providing. Diversity then in the talent that you're recruiting, because in order to serve those diverse customer markets, you have to have talent that reflects those markets. And then diversity in ideas, which has really been accelerated by technology and the disruption that technology has for us to kind of at a very quick pace reinvent ourselves. And so they did this research and they did interviews across the globe really to understand, what do leaders that are able to meet this new dynamic marketplace, what type of qualities do they have? And what are the skill sets that we all have to have in order to meet the demands of this time, which have become more accelerated now with the pandemic and with the murder of George Floyd. It's almost accelerated the need for these 6 characteristics. The characteristics are commitment, collaboration, I call it consciousness. I think the report refers to it as cognizance, curiosity, courage, and cultural intelligence. And so today, what we're going to go through is just a quick description of each of these, but I wanted to give some context around what do these actually look and feel like, both from my lived experience of different leadership roles in the private, public, and nonprofit sector, but also the experience that I have now with leaders in doing executive coaching, leadership programs, group trainings, as well as consulting to help them meet this, what I feel like very important moment in our time and in our culture to shift and meet the needs of this dynamic diversification.
Yeah, I love that. And I appreciate the, knowing and understanding, in the language that we would use as your stakeholders, right? So your employees, your customers, all the things they're talking about is really, really knowing and understanding in a way that looks different than the way we may have talked about knowing and understanding from even just a few years ago. The expectations are quite different. And I also really like the idea of, this work can feel very theoretical, right? Especially when we have a framework, but so thank you for bringing some of the tactical actual examples. And I think it's going to be really helpful. Yeah. So I think it makes sense for us just to walk through the traits. You can kind of share your interpretation of each. So the first one I know that you want to dive into is commitment. So when we talk about traits of inclusive leadership, what does commitment mean within that context?
Yeah, so commitment is an area that I initially focus on with the leaders that I coach, and it usually comes after something that creates a shift for them. So whether it's a centering event like George Floyd that all of a sudden creates this awareness that they didn't have, there's some sort of relationship that they've started to explore that's made them question their own mental model, or they've gone off and gotten some education that introduced them to a new framework that they want to explore. And so something usually kind of spurs that commitment on. And what I'm looking for when I think about commitment to being an inclusive leader is a simple math equation, which is, do you value the benefit of inclusive leadership and ultimately creating cultures of belonging more than the potential costs that can be associated with getting to that ultimate goal? So really, that's as simple as it is can we deepen your commitment to the value and the belief in the value? Because regardless of, how bad you want it, if that belief is not deep enough, then you're not going to be able to trespass or surpass all the different costs that might be associated. So I'll give you a couple examples of where I've seen the places where leaders kind of get tripped up and give up on becoming inclusive leaders because they feel like the cost outweighs the benefit. The first one really is feeling like not treating being inclusive and creating a culture of belonging the same as you would any other business outcome. So when profit is in mind, if you really think about it, there's nothing that leaders won't do in order to make sure that they get to those profit goals because they are measured by it. And it's just something that we are ultimately motivated by. But then when we think about our internal customers, often our employees, we don't have that same motivation. And so I'll give you an example of an organization that really, I think, demonstrates commitment. So this is some folks may have already heard this story, but a orchestra that was working to diversify who was in their orchestra, so who the musicians were. And they kept coming up with 95% of the people that were accepted into their orchestra being male. And so at that point, the orchestra could have said, well, it's because males just have more qualifications than females and being able to fill this role. But they believed that that wasn't the case, and they believed in the value of diversity and inclusion and belonging. And so they started to evaluate, like, what can we do different about our audition process? Mm-hmm. And so the first thing that they tried out is that they put a screen up while they were doing the auditions. And so it was a blind audition. People couldn't see who was actually auditioning, but they actually came up with the same results. So 95% of those that got accepted into the orchestra were males. And so at that point, and this is usually the point where I see leaders give up, where they try something, they feel like, the commitment is there, and then it's like, But at that point, they could have given up. But then instead, they still believed so much in that value that they went back and they looked at their process and they said, what else can we do? And the answer became very simple, which is a kind of a strange answer, but their answer was carpet. And the reason carpet came up is because when people were walking in to audition, oftentimes women would have on heels. And so people could still hear whether it was indistinguished, whether it was a woman or a man. So when they put in carpet, all of a sudden they started seeing shifts in who actually got accepted. So that's an example of not giving up. And I'll give one more example, which is I recently met an actor whose name is Jordan. He has multiple sclerosis, which caused him to walk with a limp. And so before he went to audition, he would get so nervous because, you know, all of us get nervous when we have to do things like audition in front of an audience or a director that we want to impress. But he had the added factor of feeling like who he uniquely was would not fit into the role that he was looking for, until a director said, actually, I'm going to shift this role so that the main character has a limp. And so that took off all of this anxiety from Jordan. So he was able to audition for the role as himself without trying to hide parts of himself. And so that's an example of where I feel leaders oftentimes aren't willing to value the individual human over the system. And in this case, the director said, I'm actually going to look at the humans that are involved with this and change the norms in the system to make room for their humanity versus them making him play a role that he was never actually meant to play. And so those are just two examples, but I just wanted to use them as examples for just continuing to think about how can we make sure that our value and the benefit and the belief in being inclusive is way deeper than the potential cost that often causes us to give up.
That's powerful stories. And I really like that very simple equation. It's something you can kind of revisit, right? You can kind of go back to it and say, am I valuing this the right way? And each decision that you make. So that's fantastic. Okay. So the next trait is my favorite because it pushes us a little bit out of our comfort zone. And that trait is courage. So tell us about courage.
Yeah. So courage is something all of us have to have in order to be inclusive leaders, because all of us have bias. And so for us to widen our perspective, we have to have the courage to look at ourselves and our environments in a way that maybe challenges our ways of being and doing in a way that we haven't before. All of us, we have these mental models where our minds are only able to take in 50 bits of information per second, whereas our bodies are actually taking in about 12 million bits of information per second. So the amount of information that's even going on that we're actually receiving in this room right now together is so much greater than what our minds, our mental models are able to incorporate. And so all of us have this kind of challenge of getting beyond our mental model and seeing more and being more. And so typically when organizations and trainings and in this report, people are talking about courage, they're talking about this ability to interrupt that bias and oftentimes interrupt it in the moment. So if you see some sort of bias happening, for example, one person or maybe women are the ones that are often the ones that are taking notes in your meeting and playing roles that aren't equal in a meeting, then somebody would kind of speak up and interrupt. And so that's how people oftentimes interpret courage. And I think that's absolutely courage. The one thing that I would add about courage is the ability to also have an awareness of your readiness to be the leader and also your organization's readiness to change. Because I think oftentimes I see people working to be courageous without taking that into account, and it becomes careless. So to be a leader that is inclusive, think about it as getting in shape. So you have these goals to lose weight, to be a certain muscular, to have certain muscles in your body. And if you were to get in shape, you wouldn't start with the weights that you're going to ultimately use at the end when you're in your greatest shape. So you wouldn't start with the heaviest weights. you would start with weights that kind of stretch you, but you could handle at the moment. And so oftentimes I see leaders, when they want to be courageous and to make these shifts real fast, they're not actually yet prepared. Like, they don't have the cultural intelligence. They haven't done enough digging into themselves yet to kind of take on these charges. Oftentimes I see them moving beyond where they're really ready to go. And so I recommend that you be honest about where you are and have the courage to do something that recognizes that. So for example, being courageous could look like, if you have power in an organization, sharing it with somebody who actually has already done some of the work in these other factors, to be the one to lead the charge for your organization, and you making sure that others cooperate and abide by how they're being challenged. So that's the only thing I would add to courage. Also, I would add that it's important to understand how your organization might react, because it's like any change management. There's ways you can mitigate people's resistance to change by knowing what to expect. So some common resistance to change that I see are people who are very happy with the way the organization currently is, because they actually get rewarded by some of the exclusion that it has. And so you're now expanding what they feel as their ability for success in the organization. And so how do you kind of work with those segment of folks to help them be educated about the importance of this, and also help them understand how they can be a part of the movement? I also see people who being more inclusive could actually really benefit them, but they're so used to being not believing that the organization is going to do anything, that you receive pushback from them. And there's some people that just like, they don't like change in general. Like most of us don't like change. And so they see this, this new form of leadership as more work, which honestly, at first, any change is going to be more work. But the goal here is to go slow to move fast eventually. So with courage, yes, it's interrupting bias, super important. And I just want to add that it's also about having the courage to understand exactly where you are and exactly where others are in your organization, and actually planning for kind of what's the most responsible way to enact change.
It's like you hear stories of people making these big overtures, right? These courageous overtures in their organizations. And that gets kind of held up as being if you're not doing, like, you need to be doing that. But most people aren't ready to do either, because it's not comfortable in the organization, or doesn't feel safe to them, or they don't have all the other skills. So I think I hear you, I think also saying, like, it's okay to do what you're ready for. Courage could be something very small that builds into something bigger. It could be a piece of something that also collaborates with other people who are being courageous to make change. It doesn't have to be one person kind of doing the big overtures all the time.
Yeah, and just don't be afraid to share power, because this work does take some deep personal work in order to do it well. And if you haven't gone through that journey yourself, then you may not be the person that you should use your power in the way that is best suited for you to use your power. But I think that this type of work really does require some sharing of power to honor all the different experiences that can come to bear toward an overall goal of inclusive cultures and organizations.
Great. I think that will come into our next trait here, which you mentioned that the Deloitte report refers to it as cognizance, but in conscious capitalism, and you also prefer the language of consciousness.
Yeah.
So how does consciousness play into being a more inclusive leader?
Yeah, so consciousness is so important to go on our individual journey of understanding and unraveling ourselves a bit, to be able to have empathy toward the experiences that ultimately come up in your organization. So I think consciousness is such a deep step. And so for a couple of things, one, I had mentioned before that we only have access to a small amount of information that's actually coming at us every second. So that's mainly because we're relying on our cognitive world, and we've been conditioned to rely mostly on our mental models. But we also have access to intelligence in our body, in our heart, and in our spirit. And so part of consciousness is opening ourselves up to more intelligence than just our mental models, which most of us have been trained to rely heavily on. And then the second part, I believe, is then really understanding your own mental model, where there are limitations and how it got there. So I liken it to clearing out your closet. So in your closet, oftentimes you have pieces of clothing that you use all the time that are in the front, like whether it's your work clothes, whether it's the clothes that you take your kids to school in, your workout clothes, those are the most accessible to you. And so you think about those as identities that everyone's aware, very visible to everyone. And that's what you identify with the most, what others identify you as. But then when you if you were to take everything out of your closet and dump it all on the floor, you would also have some pieces of clothing that maybe you looked at and you were like, wow, I haven't used that in so long. And I love that. I don't know why I haven't, I don't know why I haven't used that. And probably one of the reasons you haven't used it is because now you're in an environment where you don't need that as much, or it's not as important for you to use. And I liken that to a lot of us when we're in different environments, we hide parts of our identity in order to fit the needs of that environment. So I recently had somebody I was coaching who did that with her femininity when she went into a consulting environment. Like she tucked in the parts of her that were very relational, really like to connect, were less analytical, to fit into her consulting environment. And so when we really went into this exploration of everything that was in her closet, all of who she was, she decided, you know what, I actually want to take this part of me out, because I think more people need to see a leader that's also very feminine in this environment. Then we also have pieces that maybe at one point were cool, but now that we look at them, we're kind of ashamed that we even wore them. They're very outdated. They don't fit that time. And so I liken that to our biases that we had, that maybe in a certain time, in a certain culture, they were okay. But now we're looking at them, we're like, ugh, no, why did I ever wear that? And so those are the pieces where we probably want to get rid of the belief, but we don't want to get rid of the experience of the fact that we actually had them, because it'll help us relate to what we see coming up in our own organizations. So in our own organizations, we're going to have people who have had to hide parts of themselves, in order to fit in. And maybe we don't have to hide ourselves to the extreme that others have had to. For example, there's a huge movement now in allowing Black women to just wear their hair natural. When if you think about it, it's like, why does that have to be a thing that people had to hide who they truly are? But that's happening all the time in big ways and small ways. And so even if it applies to you in a small way, and all of us have had to hide ourselves in some way, that entry point of how you had to do that helps you then create empathy for others in your organization. So leverage that. And the parts of you that you are ashamed of, and all of us have, because of our biases, have beliefs that at one point seemed okay, but now we're just like, wow, this is not okay. We still need to honor that experience and what it took for us to let it go in order to reach out to those in our organization that are going to have the same challenges. And so consciousness for me is really taking a look at all of who you are, the parts that you kind of show that are visible to everybody, and the parts of yourself that maybe you've kind of hidden a little bit further back, and bringing them all out to then think about, how can I use all these parts of me in service of creating a more inclusive environment and a greater purpose and vision at this moment.
Love that. And I love that the kind of, awareness of bias and not kind of being able to be aware of that bias, acknowledge it, right, and move on. Still have it and be aware.
Yeah.
So once your consciousness is raised and you become more awakened, the next trait is curiosity. And I actually really love the word curiosity itself. There's a lot of hope and opportunity behind it if we can really lean into it. So let's talk about how curiosity shows up.
Yeah, so curiosity, I think, kind of goes hand in hand with the exploration of consciousness, because oftentimes as we're even uncovering parts of ourselves, it's important for us to get curious with those parts of ourselves. Like, how did you get that way in the first place? Where did that come from? Or why did you decide to hide that part, but do it in a non-judgmental way? So important as we go through the consciousness to actually be kind and have compassion for ourselves, because that's kind of the same way we're going to have to treat other people when we are being curious with them. And so as we think about curiosity, when it comes to interpersonal and on our teams, there's two things that I would keep in mind. One, our mental models often create these stories of who we think people are.
Mhm.
So our unconscious bias is really the stories, and this is, I think Brene Meyer says this, our unconscious bias are the stories we have about people before we actually know them. But then once we get to know people, the thing to remember is that prejudice rarely survives relationship. And I know that's a quote from probably from somebody else, but prejudice. So as we are in relationship with people who we thought they were, like 99% of the time, it's going to be so less interesting than who they actually are. And so this idea of moving toward people, perspective taking, active listening is filling in the gap between what our story told us and what the data, the real life understanding of who each person is. And it's important for us to fill that gap. And leaders that are inclusive really take the time to recognize that each person actually deserves that curiosity, because regardless of how much we have in common, the way all of our identities come together, all of our experiences, our values come together, it's going to be unique to each one of us. And so each one of us is unique. And so that curiosity applies to each individual. And that's where that comes in.
And true change comes from those one-on-one connections, right? It comes from an awareness of learning, of leaning in and being curious about someone else, learning something new. And it just can change everything about the way it might change the way that you perceive that one person, but it also can just open up your mind the way you see a group of people that you maybe had a sense about, or a story you were telling yourself about people, or hundreds of thousands of people. And that's kind of the beauty, just the ability of one relationship to change so much if you get curious.
Yeah, and the curiosity takes courage, because again, we cling to these mental models because they offer some sort of representation of what truth is for us. And so for us to get curious, we have to be willing to challenge that sense of security that we have and admit that maybe it was wrong, maybe it's incomplete. And that's just a hard place for us to get to. So inclusive leaders are used to feeling a little rattled, a little triggered, a little bit like, oh, I was wrong about that. So that's a big part of curiosity is the courage to challenge and to know that as much as you think you know, there's so much more that you don't.
And to be excited by that, I would say.
Yeah, to be excited about that journey and know that we're all lifelong students. And so we could be learning each day from each individual, given their unique identities.
Yeah. All right. So the next trait is one that we've been hearing more and more about over the past few years, but not everyone may have clarity on what it is. And that's cultural intelligence. So what does it mean to be culturally intelligent? Why is it important? And how can leaders show up with cultural intelligence?
Yeah. So if we think about what we were just talking about consciousness and our mental models and disrupting our personal mental models, because that's the representation of who we as individuals see as truth. We also then have communities and societies that collectively get to shared understandings of what truth is. And so there's this collective mental model of that there's agreement on, that says this is the oftentimes behaviors and norms that are accepted as a way of expressing their individual truth. And our goal with cultural competency is to get curious about the behaviors, oftentimes honor the behaviors, but also to get to the deeper understanding of the meaning and the truth and connecting to that, which is often like a value that we share. So I'll give an example. This was like probably like a decade ago. I went to India, and when I was staying at a friend's place from grad school, and every morning I was woken up by this ceremony that was happening outside her door, and people were worshiping at kind of the crack of dawn to midnight, and then doing it over and over again for several days. And I asked my friend's dad to take me to visit, to understand a little bit more about the culture. And he took me to a Sikh temple. And as soon as I went into the temple, all these people rushed up to me and they were like, oh my gosh, you had to put something on your head. And so I had like a scarf at the time. I put that on my head. felt a little bit embarrassed that I didn't know that. And when we were leaving the temple, I asked my friend's dad, I said, why was that such a big deal to them? And he said, well, it's a way of showing reverence to put something on your head. And so he was like, imagine if you went into a Christian church and you were wearing a baseball cap. And I know some days this is like acceptable, but some of the churches that I grew up in, that would not be acceptable at all. And so it would be a sign of irreverence. And so it's at that moment that I realized the opposite thing had the same truth and meaning in different cultures. And so my job in being culturally competent was to move toward the behavior and the action as their way of showing reverence and their spiritual truth, but then also to connect to, we had the same desire for showing reverence and a deeper meaning. And so that's what I would say is cultural competence, is it operates on two levels, which is the visible, which often comes what I call the hands, which is like the things that we do, our behaviors, but then digging deeper into the essence of why, and understanding that and connecting to it on a more human level.
I love that story. It's just a simple story that really exemplifies what this is about. So, and again, I think you see this so often. It's just really tuning into those moments and getting curious about them.
Yeah, getting curious, because more times than not, there is a shared sense of values, a shared sense of humanity that we can connect to once we dig further down. But you actually have to first create the relationship. You have to show reverence. You have to honor how people interpret their different truths and their different values in order to even get to that point where you can understand, like, how do we all connect just as human beings?
Yeah, amazing. All right, so we have one last trait to kind of go over, and that one is collaboration. So let's dig into that a little bit.
Yeah, so collaboration then, for me, is then creating an environment of allowing all of these multiple truths and oftentimes interpretations of how people act out the truth, creating environments where there's space for all of it. So where there's space for somebody that needs to wear something over their head when they show reverence to their God, and there's space for somebody who feels like that is irreverent, all in the same place, and they're respecting each other. And this can go in many different forms. It could be space, like if you value family in your organization, but for some people that means what we've seen as traditional in our westernized world as having two parents and et cetera, versus maybe a single mom, and being able to say, okay, we have the same value. This looks different in my home versus in your home. And then how do you create policies and conditions that honor that you share the same value, but it might look very different, and there might be very different needs in order to honor each of those individuals. And so the way that I tell people that you should get to collaborating is by ensuring that everyone on the team is treated like a VIP, meaning that everyone's voice, identity, and power is honored. And so if you can get to that point, then you can collaborate in a way where you can have healthy conflict to get to norms and policies and procedures that actually honor everybody that's in the room. So for voice, oftentimes in organizations, there are a certain group of people, maybe like 10%, the ones that are speaking the most in a meeting. And so the way that you control for that is actually monitor, like in every meeting, like tallying, like who's speaking and who isn't speaking, and just bringing that to the forefront. How do we actually even this out? So what you'll often see is it's people who are the most outspoken and the people that have the most power that are the ones that are speaking the most. And so just bringing it to people's consciousness helps shift that dynamic. Identity, again, we talked about how, each of us has a unique identity based on our lived experiences, based on our different characteristics and traits and our values. And so getting to a point where we go deep enough in relationship with those on our team that we really understand the intersection of all their identities is a way of honoring identity And then power, again, is just understanding who has the ability to influence what the culture and the norms end up being. Like, do people actually have the ability, like if they say something and they say, this doesn't actually fit who I am, like um, when we get days off, what time we have to leave the office, that doesn't work for who I am and my lifestyle, because of these special needs. And do they have the chance and the ability to influence, then what is the norm for the organization? And so I often do this exercise in my trainings where I have people put sticky notes up of saying, who has the most power on this team, and they rank them from right to left. And it's just a very uncomfortable conversation, but
Yeah.
then you get to then understand all the different dynamics that are going on and who actually and why the power is there. And oftentimes it's either position, sometimes it's identity, like being male, sometimes it's being most outspoken, sometimes it's relationships, sometimes it's time in the organization. And so then you have a real conversation about how do you level out that power in a way that everybody has the ability to speak and influence the culture.
Can you say a little bit about power when it comes to doing DEI work? So I feel like we often hear about, the people who get asked to do DEI work, right? And kind of the imbalance of power there. So as opposed to the rest of the work where, this group of people gets the opportunity to do this work, when it comes to DEI work, I think there tends to be this assumption that we're going to certain people to do that work, and how that power imbalance happens.
Yeah, a lot of people were put in an awkward position after the murder of George Floyd, where they became the person in their organization that had to be the face of whatever change they were making. And so it's just important. I think two things are important. One is making sure that this is something that the person really, really wants and is signing up for, because there's a lot of emotional tax that comes along with leading diversity and inclusion for your organization. And so if this person is a bankruptcy lawyer, and now you're asking them to also be a DEI expert, like those are two different competencies. So one is asking, and two is compensating and recognizing that there is a lot of extra work. There's emotional tasks. There's emotional tax with doing the work. And so compensating appropriately. And then if you're going to put somebody in that position, then people who are in positional power in the organization really need to be ready to enforce their recommendations. And so oftentimes people are often put in that position. They're not given enough resources to actually implement the change. So liken it to any major initiative where you would do change management in your organization. You would fully resource it if you really believed in it and you believed in the profit that it could yield for your organization. So this again goes with commitment and making sure people are actually set up for success to lead the change.
Thank you for that. I know we have a few minutes left. If you do have a question, please drop it into the Q&A box here at the bottom of the screen. One question that I want to ask is, we walked through these kind of in a specific order, and you kind of alluded to this before, but do you feel that to do this work, there's a specific order one must or should follow to make the biggest shift, or can people just start wherever they are and kind of lead themselves, or is it all happening at the same time? Like, how does this framework get implemented in that way?
So I think that they oftentimes are very dynamic. So these different traits are used with each other in order to get to the outcome. But what I would say is typically there has to be some sort of centering moment in like I notice when I coach leaders that there's some sort of centering moment that causes them to shift from the unconsciousness that they're in or the current kind of status quo that they're in to then want to change. And so again, they're in some sort of they get to some sort of place where the cost of staying the same outweighs the cost of changing. And they start to notice things, or the pressure becomes so deep in what they're noticing that they have to have change, and they have to get to this courage and the curiosity and do some deep introspection. So I would say that for everything else, they probably all work together, but typically there's this awakening moment or this tipping point where we become aware of some unconsciousness that we weren't aware of before, that we now have an urgency to address. So I would say that's typically what
That
comes
kicks it
first.
off.
Yeah, that kicks it off. Yeah, it kicks off the spiral of moving. So, but the other ones I think are just always just a part of the dynamic process. But I would also just say that I think doing the work for yourself and understanding your own story and having empathy with your own story, building a relationship with the parts of you that you're not as proud of or the parts that you have hidden. I find that process should probably happen first, and educating yourself first before moving and putting yourself out as a leader for a larger team or an organization.
And there's another framework that you use that I really like called the cycle of socialization.
Yeah.
Right. And I would suggest this is really helpful for me, for anyone to just Google cycle of socialization, which I think will support a lot of the things you're saying about getting to know all the different parts of yourself and how they come into play. So that's just another framework.
Yeah. So that's by researcher Bobby Harrow. And she kind of talks about that, how we've kind of received messages, you know, from the day we were born. So we weren't born with any of these messages or socialization, but then by the people that we love the most, usually like our parents, our primary caretakers, our teachers, those closest to us, and then you know, influences such as media or government or the schools that we go to or the religious organizations we go to, we receive these messages about what truth is, and then we all reach a point where we have to just question whether or not that is our truth. And so she goes through also not only what that cycle of socialization is, to then what does liberation look like? And oftentimes it looks like deepening your commitment to your own sense of belonging, and a purpose around inclusion, or creating a different type of culture, that you then have the courage to say, okay, actually, let me shift out of this, find other people that may have the same beliefs, and almost like organize or collaborate around creating something new, that is maybe a broader or more expansive truth. So yeah, I would definitely recommend looking into that. It's called The Cycle of Socialization and Liberation by researcher Bobby Harrow. And I think that does a great job of talking about this kind of awakening in consciousness.
Great. And we do have someone asking a question of how do I find the Deloitte report you referenced? And we can, we'll send a follow-up email after this session with the recording, and we'll include the Deloitte report. Maybe we can also include a link to the cycle of socialization. Have a question from an anonymous attendee. How would you attempt to convince leaders that the business case for inclusivity is as important as the human and ethical case?
So there's a lot of data out there. There's a group called Better Up that has done some pretty extensive research on the business case for belonging. And so I'll just tell you some of the data that they came up with, which is organizations that create the sense of belonging tend to have a 56% increase in job performance, a 50% drop in turnover risk, a 75% reduction in sick days. For a 10,000 person company, this can equate to a huge amount of savings, about $52 million in savings. But if you think about that, and the reason is why, if you think about this, belonging is a basic human need. And so we need food and shelter, we need basic safety of our physical body. And then right after that, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, you need belonging and love. And that is before you get to what he would call self-actualization. And so when you're giving that for employees, when you're giving them a sense of belonging, then you're allowing them to get to their most creative and innovative self. And that's going to show up in them showing up more often, but also bringing innovation to your organization, because they'll have the capacity, with that sense of belonging, to get to their most innovative selves.
Yeah,
so it's a human capital concern as well.
Mm-hmm. Yep. We are at a quarter of. We have one other question, but it's kind of long, and I think that I might just opt to send it to you afterwards, and maybe we can have you write a little paragraph response, and we can send it out with our follow-up email if that works.
Around what advice you have for organizations whose efforts seem to create belonging for some, but at the
Oh no,
expense.
that one just popped in. That one just came in. It was the one on. But if you want to address that one quickly, it seems like a little bit more of a concise question.
Yeah.
You can do that. What advice or thoughts do you have for organizations whose efforts seem to create belonging for some, but at the expense of others?
So the advice that I have is when you're thinking about belonging, there's a framework called targeted universalism. Targeted universalism is this idea that we universally want to have belonging in the organization, but that you want to have targeted strategies that are differentiated for groups based on where they are in that universal goal. So say you want 100% of people to feel a sense of belonging at your organization, and then you have one group that has 95% of them feel belonging, or this demographic has 95% feeling belonging. But then you have another group that like 40% of people feel a sense of belonging. And you can see it, you can divide it up by things like race or level in the organization and see where different groups may segment in this way. You would have a very different strategy for a group that 95% of them felt a sense of belonging. So maybe it's a much smaller strategy, but you would still pay attention to them. And then you would have a more intense strategy for the group that felt a lower sense of belonging. And so I would recommend for every organization to include everyone in thinking about how can we create a sense of belonging. So you're not ignoring anyone, or it shouldn't be at the expense of anyone. You're just looking at data and saying who has the biggest opportunity for intervention, and then you're creating appropriate strategies and allocating resources appropriate to the actual need, like you would for any business issue. But that one's called Targeted Universalism, and it's from UC Berkeley Center of Belongingness, or Center of Belonging.
Great, and we can also include that link in the follow-up. We are out of time. I could talk about this with you for hours, of course. Thank you so much for coming in and sharing more with us about this framework. If folks want to get in touch with you, Kim, do you want to drop your email address in the chat maybe, if folks want to learn more about you or ask any questions about anything you shared today? We did also drop a survey into the chat. If you can take a second and just give us some feedback about today so we can continue to improve our programming, we would very much appreciate that. If you're new to Conscious Capitalism, visit consciouscapitalism.org for more information about our movement and organization. And what else? If you're an executive currently implementing conscious practices in your business, we invite you to explore a growing support system of like-valued leaders in our Conscious Capitalism Senior Leader Network. You can visit our website, consciouscapitalism.org/senior-leaders to learn more. And we'll continue to have these virtual gatherings coming up in the coming months. So keep an eye out on our website for more announcements. And we hope that you'll join us again. And thanks again once more, Kim. It was great to be with you today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me. And thank you everybody that attended.